Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something very relaxing. We're going to lie down, unclench our jaw, and slowly drift back to a time when governments were absolutely obsessed with opening other people's letters. So dim the lights, put your phone face down, pretend you're not thinking about tomorrow, and let's gently wander into the 1700s. A century powdered with wigs, sealed with wax, and absolutely riddled with paranoia. Because tonight's story is about something called black cabinets, which sounds cool, mysterious, almost stylish. They were not stylish. They were basically early government mail snooping rooms run by deeply anxious men in badly tailored coats who believed, correctly but still dramatically, that everyone was plotting something. And of course they were. The 1700s were not a calm time. Europe was one long family argument with crowns involved. Every royal house was related, offended, suspicious, and extremely bad at keeping secrets. So, naturally, the solution was to read everyone's mail, quietly, constantly, and then pretend nothing happened. Let's ease into it. Back in the early modern world, letters were everything. There were no phones, no texts, no emails accidentally sent to the wrong group chat. If you wanted to confess love, plan a coup, complain about your cousin the king, or casually suggest invading Poland, you wrote a letter. And those letters traveled slowly, by horse, by carriage, by boat, often through government-controlled post offices, which meant they were very easy to intercept. And once governments realized that, something in their collective soul just snapped. The term black cabinet didn't come from the furniture, sadly. It came from the idea of secrecy, dark rooms, hidden offices, places that officially didn't exist. Almost every major European power had one. France, Austria, Prussia, Britain. Even smaller states who couldn't afford armies but could afford a guy with a knife at a kettle to steam open envelopes. The basic process was simple. The ethics were not discussed. Letters would arrive at the post office. Specific ones, foreign diplomats, nobles, suspicious merchants, would be quietly set aside. They'd be taken to the black cabinet, opened with steam so the seal could be reused, copied word for word, sometimes decoded because people loved using terrible ciphers, then resealed and sent on their way. The recipient never knew, usually, unless the seal was slightly crooked or the letter smelled faintly of soup. Now, the real star of this story, and the one who did this with the most confidence, was France, because of course it was. France in the 1700s was a country run on appearances, silk, perfume, etiquette manuals longer than the Bible. And behind all that elegance, a government that did not trust anyone, at all. The French black cabinet was known as le cabinet noir, which sounds cool and ominous and very French. It operated openly as a secret. Everyone important knew it existed. They just pretended not to notice. Louis XIV had encouraged it. Louis XV expanded it. Louis XVI inherited it, and then lost his head later, but we'll get there eventually. By the mid-1700s, the Cabinet Noir was reading thousands of letters a week. Diplomats writing home, nobles complaining about court politics, mistresses gossiping, spies reporting on spies who were spying on other spies. It was bureaucracy, but make it nosy. And the people who worked there were fascinating. These were not glamorous courtiers. These were meticulous, quiet men who loved patterns. They could replicate handwriting perfectly, reseal wax without leaving fingerprints, decode ciphers that nobles thought were very clever. They were the human version of, "We noticed you changed one word." And the French government adored them because information was power and also entertainment. There are records of ministers reading intercepted letters out loud to each other, laughing softly, and then deciding foreign policy. Imagine your worst text being read in a candlelit room by men in wigs. That was the 1700s. Now, let's gently float over to Austria. The Habsburgs, a family tree that looks more like a family wreath, they had their own black cabinet in Vienna, and they were very serious about it. Maria Theresa, Empress, mother of 16, and professional worrier, relied heavily on intercepted correspondence. She didn't trust Prussia, she didn't trust France, she didn't trust her own children. Honestly fair. Her cabinet read letters from ambassadors, generals, and even her own allies. And because this is the Habsburgs, the results were usually depressing. Letters revealed incompetence, betrayal, emotional breakdowns. One ambassador wrote long, rambling complaints about being ignored at court. Another confessed he had no idea what was going on and hoped no one noticed. They noticed. Austria used this information to quietly sideline people, deny promotions, adjust marriages. Nothing dramatic, just slow, suffocating control. Which is very on brand for an empire that ruled by paperwork and jawlines. Prussia, meanwhile, approached the Black Cabinet with military efficiency. Frederick the Great, philosopher king, flute enthusiast, and deeply anxious ruler, believed intelligence was everything. He read intercepted letters personally, sometimes late at night, while listening to music, which feels intimate in a way that history probably didn't need. Frederick didn't trust anyone either, especially not Austria, definitely not France, and absolutely not his own generals. His cabinet focused heavily on foreign diplomats. They copied letters quickly, analyzed tone, noted emotional shifts. If an ambassador suddenly sounded nervous, Prussia assumed something was coming. Sometimes they were right, sometimes they were just spiraling. Now let's drift across the channel. Britain technically disapproved of black cabinets, publicly. Privately, they absolutely had one. It was run through the post office, very politely, very quietly. British officials intercepted foreign mail under something called secret office warrants, which is just legal language for don't ask. Letters from French diplomats were opened, copied, translated, and Britain had an advantage. A massive empire meant letters were everywhere. Colonies wrote home, merchants complained, governors panicked, and London read it all. One intercepted letter from an American colonial leader complained about British taxes and hinted at resistance. It was noted, filed, and ignored, which in hindsight feels like a missed opportunity. The thing about black cabinets is that they created an illusion of control. Governments felt informed, prepared, ahead of events, but information without wisdom is just gossip with a budget. Ministers drowned in letters, thousands of them, contradictory, emotional, petty. One noble would swear loyalty in ink, another would complain about him 3 letters later. Who do you believe? Usually the one that confirmed what you already thought, which made black cabinets excellent at reinforcing paranoia, and paranoia was already thriving. There's something deeply human about this. The belief that if you just read enough messages, you'll finally feel safe. It never works. People knew, vaguely, that their mail might be read, so they wrote in codes. Bad ones. They replaced names with classical references, called kings the sun or the eagle, used invisible ink made from lemon juice. Black cabinets adapted. They hired classicists, chemists, people whose entire job was ruining secrecy. Some letters were so dull that even spies got bored. Long discussions about dinner, health complaints, endless court gossip. And yet, every now and then, something important slipped through. Plans, alliances, affairs, and that made it all worth it. By the late 1700s, black cabinets were everywhere, and they were expensive. Staff, space, supplies. Empires were spending huge sums to read mail while their economies strained. And then, something changed. Ideas started spreading faster than letters. Pamphlets, newspapers, public opinion. You couldn't steam open an idea. The French Revolution loomed, and the black cabinet kept reading letters even as the world outside stopped caring what was secret. Soon people weren't whispering treason in ink, they were shouting it in cafes, and black cabinets began to feel quaint. But we're not there yet. For now, we're still in the quiet rooms, the candlelight, the soft crack of wax seals, men leaning over desks, copying someone else's thoughts, convinced this would keep the world stable. It wouldn't, but it did make for excellent insomnia content. Nothing loud happened while you were gone. No revolutions yet. Just a few more letters quietly opened, copied, and resealed with unsettling precision. If you're just settling in again, that's fine. Adjust the pillow, let your shoulders drop. Tonight, we continue drifting through the softly invasive world of the 1700s black cabinets. Because once governments realized they could read everything, they didn't just stop at military secrets. Of course they didn't. They read love letters. They read complaints. They read emotional spirals written at 3 in the morning by aristocrats who absolutely should not have been given pens. And this is where things get gently tragic, because one of the first things black cabinets discovered was that powerful people are incredibly messy on paper. Let's start with romance. In the 18th century, love letters were dramatic, painfully so. People wrote like every sentence might be their last. They swore eternal devotion after 2 meetings. They threatened heartbreak. They begged. And black cabinets read all of it. In France, intercepted love letters became a secondary intelligence stream. Mistresses wrote to ministers. Ministers wrote to actresses. Nobles wrote to married women with alarming confidence. And because everyone was related to everyone else, these letters mattered. If a duke was secretly involved with the wrong person, it could be used quietly. Not blackmail. That was crude. Instead, invitations stopped arriving. Appointments were delayed. Rumors circulated. A career didn't end in a scandal. It just faded. One famous case involved a French diplomat who poured his heart out to a woman at court. Long letters, emotional vulnerability, complaints about being overlooked. The cabinet noir read every word. The woman never responded because the letters never reached her. Instead, the diplomat was quietly reassigned, far away, to somewhere cold and politically irrelevant. He never knew why. He died believing he'd simply been unlucky. That was the black cabinet way. Now let's gently slide over to Vienna again. The Austrian cabinet was particularly interested in emotional instability, which, to be fair, was common in Habsburg correspondence. Letters from nobles often read like therapy journals: anxiety, jealousy, resentment toward siblings who inherited better chins. Maria Theresa's officials flagged people who sounded fragile. If someone wrote too emotionally, they were considered unreliable. If they complained too much, they were quietly removed from influence. The irony is beautiful. In an era where marriages were political transactions and childhoods were emotionally barren, the government punished people for having feelings. One general wrote repeated letters describing exhaustion, confusion, and fear of failure. The cabinet concluded he lacked firmness of spirit. He was replaced. No confrontation, no explanation, just silence. Prussia took a different approach. Frederick the Great was fascinated by tone. He believed letters revealed character, which is a terrifying belief if you've ever sent a bad email. If an ambassador wrote with too much confidence, Frederick suspected arrogance. If they wrote cautiously, he suspected weakness. There was no winning. One Prussian official was noted for using excessive flattery in letters. Frederick found it insincere. His career stalled, not because he failed, but because his compliments were too enthusiastic. Imagine being sabotaged by your own politeness. Now, Britain's black cabinet specialized in something very specific: colonial anxiety. Letters from the American colonies poured in, merchants complaining about taxes, governors begging for troops, officials warning of unrest. London read them all, and then did nothing, because the letters contradicted each other. One official said everything was fine, another predicted rebellion, a third just wanted a raise. So British ministers did what ministers always do when overwhelmed by information: they delayed. The Black Cabinet gave them knowledge, but not clarity. And this is where the system begins to quietly collapse under its own weight, because reading everyone's mail creates a strange problem. You start to know too much. Ministers learned things they were never meant to know: that allies disliked them, that generals doubted orders, that spouses were unfaithful. And once you know something, you can't unknow it. So relationships shifted, trust eroded, diplomats became cautious, letters became colder, more formal, which made black cabinets suspicious. Why has his tone changed? Why is she suddenly vague? Why did he stop writing on Tuesdays? Entire theories were built on punctuation, sometimes literally. There are records of intercepted letters being analyzed for pauses, crossouts, ink density. One French official believed hesitation marks indicated disloyalty, which is a lot. Meanwhile, people adapted. They started sending letters through friends, through servants, through unofficial couriers. Black cabinets responded by expanding. More staff, more interception points. It became an arms race of paranoia, and it affected personal lives deeply. One Austrian noblewoman wrote frequent letters to her brother, expressing loneliness and frustration. They were intercepted. Officials worried she was emotionally unstable, which again, fair. She was discouraged from attending court, quietly isolated. Her letters were cries for connection. The government read them as warning signs. She died young, unremarked. Another case in France involved a man who joked about the king in a private letter. A joke, dry, nothing dramatic. The cabinet read it. They didn't arrest him. That would draw attention. Instead, his pension was delayed, his requests ignored, his friends drifted away. The joke cost him everything, slowly. Which brings us to the strangest part of all this. The black cabinets weren't just tools of power, they were mirrors. They showed governments what people really thought, and governments didn't like the reflection. They learned that loyalty was conditional, that fear was common, that respect was often performative. And instead of addressing that, they doubled down on surveillance, because that's easier than reform. By the late 1700s, even ministers began to fear the black cabinets. They knew their letters might be read too, so they wrote carefully, which made communication worse. Misunderstandings multiplied. Orders became vague. Decisions delayed. Empires slowed under the weight of their own caution. And still, the cabinets kept working, because no one wanted to be the one who stopped reading. What if the next letter mattered? What if the next one revealed everything? It never does. Now, as we gently drift forward in time, something interesting starts to happen. People stop caring as much, not because surveillance ends, but because expression changes. Ideas move into public spaces, salons, pamphlets, cafes. You can't intercept a conversation shouted across a table. Black cabinets become less effective. They still read letters, but the important thoughts are happening elsewhere. And slowly, very slowly, these once powerful rooms begin to feel outdated. Still busy, still secret, but no longer central. The late 1700s arrived quietly. No announcement, no dramatic shift, just the slow feeling that the old systems were getting tired. Black cabinets were still operating, letters were still being opened, wax seals were still being softened with steam and carefully pressed back into place. But something was different. The letters themselves had changed. They were shorter now, less emotional, more cautious.
People had learned. They knew someone might be reading, so they stopped saying much at all, which made the cabinets nervous, because silence is harder to interpret than confession. In France, the cabinet noir continued its daily routine. Clerks arrived early, they sorted stacks of mail, they copied and filed. But fewer letters contained anything useful. Diplomats wrote in polite generalities, nobles avoided opinions, even gossip felt restrained. Everything sounded official, safe, boring. And boredom is dangerous to a surveillance system, because boredom makes you start seeing patterns that aren't there. Officials began overanalyzing tiny details, a delayed letter, a changed signature, a different type of paper. Why did he switch ink? Why did she stop using pet names? What does it mean? Most of the time, it meant nothing. But black cabinets had never been good at accepting that answer. Meanwhile, outside those quiet rooms, something loud was forming: public opinion. In Paris, cafes filled with talk, pamphlets circulated hand to hand, ideas spread quickly, openly, and without envelopes. You didn't need to write treason anymore. You could say it out loud. The cabinet noir read letters warning of unrest, then more letters, then too many letters. They documented everything and did nothing, because knowing about a storm doesn't mean you can stop it. Austria felt the shift too. Vienna's cabinet noticed fewer personal letters and more official reports, less feeling, more distance. People were withdrawing inward or speaking outward, but not writing. Maria Theresa was gone. Her successors inherited the system, but not her instinct. They read, they worried, they hesitated, and hesitation was fatal in a fast-changing world. Prussia adapted better, but only slightly. Frederick the Great aged. His interest in letters faded. He still read some, but his confidence wavered. Too much information had worn him down. He knew too many secrets, too many doubts, and secrets lose their power when everyone feels unstable. In Britain, intercepted colonial letters slowed, not because the colonies were calm, but because the conversation had moved elsewhere. Meetings, committees, declarations, things you couldn't steam open. Black cabinets were designed for a world where power whispered. The late 1700s did not whisper. They argued, they printed, they shouted. Still, the cabinets stayed open, because institutions don't close themselves. They linger. Clerks kept copying letters that no longer mattered. Ministers skimmed reports they didn't trust. Surveillance continued out of habit. And then, in France, everything broke. The cabinet noir intercepted desperate letters from nobles trying to escape, warnings, pleading. By the time those letters were read, it was already too late. Secrecy had lost. The fall of the old order did not come with a memo. Black cabinets were not formally dissolved in most places. No one stood up in a parliament and announced that governments would stop opening mail. That would have been unrealistic. Instead, the rooms simply became less important. In France, the cabinet noir did not survive the revolution in any meaningful way. Its records were scattered, some destroyed, some seized, some quietly vanished into private collections. The people who worked there did not become villains, they became unemployed. A few tried to explain their work as patriotic service, others kept silent. Silence was a skill they had practiced for years. The new revolutionary government was not interested in secret letters. They preferred public declarations, denunciations, and speeches delivered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Surveillance didn't disappear, it just became more direct. Austria's black cabinet faded more slowly. The Habsburg state loved paperwork too much to abandon it entirely. Mail interception continued, but it was narrower, more bureaucratic, less intimate. Officials no longer lingered over emotional letters. They focused on logistics, money, troop movements. The age of reading people's feelings for political insight was ending. Empires wanted numbers now. Prussia quietly integrated its cabinet into military intelligence. No more philosophical reflections over intercepted ink, just reports, summaries, and conclusions. Frederick's successors wanted efficiency, not curiosity. The letters were stripped of personality and reduced to bullet points. Britain followed a similar path. Mail interception became a legal mechanism buried in administrative language. No dark rooms, no dramatic secrecy, just forms. And that, in many ways, was the real legacy of the Black Cabinets. They taught governments something important, not how to control people, but how much effort it takes to try. The cabinets had promised certainty. They delivered confusion. They had promised foresight. They produced anxiety. Reading everyone's mail did not prevent wars. It did not stop revolutions. It did not preserve monarchies. It simply created the illusion that chaos could be managed if you just read one more letter. And that illusion was powerful because it felt active, responsible, smart, even as the world ignored it. By the early 1800s, communication was changing again. Faster delivery, more volume. Black cabinets could not keep up. The cost was too high, the returns too small. And yet the idea never died. The rooms closed, the cabinets emptied, but the instinct remained. The belief that private communication holds the truth, that if you can just see what people say when they think no one is watching, you will understand everything. The 1700s proved the opposite. People contradict themselves, they exaggerate, they vent. Letters captured moments, not intentions. Black cabinets mistook emotion for action, anxiety for rebellion, silence for conspiracy. They listened too closely and understood too little. By the time governments realized this, history had already moved forward. New technologies would revive the same dream in different forms, new systems, new justifications. But the pattern would be familiar. Collect everything, read everything, feel safer, and still be surprised. The black cabinets of the 1700s were not failures in design. They worked exactly as intended. They opened letters, they gathered secrets, they just could not do the one thing governments wanted most. They could not make the future predictable. And when the letters stopped mattering, the cabinets faded into archives, footnotes, and forgotten rooms that once smelled faintly of wax and steam. Not evil, not heroic, just tired systems trying to listen to a world that had already learned to speak somewhere else. We're thinking about death, and specifically the people who literally ate it. I mean that. They were called sin eaters, and yes, their job was to consume sins. Not metaphorically, not for symbolic Instagram photos, but with bread, sometimes with ale. A slice of bread, dipped or bitten, ceremonially passing from the grieving family to the mouth of the sin eater. And just like that, the sins of the deceased were supposed to leave the world, except, well, they stayed in the sin eater's stomach. Poor bastards. We first see this practice in Wales and the borderlands of England, mostly around the 17th and 18th centuries. Of course, it probably existed earlier in other forms. Humans have always been inventive about guilt. But in these rural, misty hills, a sin eater was a recognized, though socially marginal figure. Think of them as freelance grief management specialists, but with very questionable health plans. Now, being a sin eater wasn't glamorous. Actually, it was socially complicated. They were both necessary and slightly feared. Families needed them, sure, but inviting someone to your home to chew on the spiritual residue of your late uncle's lifelong sins, well, it's a bit awkward. And there were rules. Always bread, sometimes beer, and ideally, don't drop it on the floor, although nobody really audited that part. Most sin eaters were poor, elderly, or otherwise socially marginal. Often they were widows or people without a stable means of survival, because why not add a dash of spiritual labor to an already difficult life? And they got paid, usually in food, a few coins, or some clothes. Not a fortune, but enough to keep going. The work was simple, repetitive, and, if you squint, meditative. Eat bread, say the words, watch the family's tension ease. A job for someone who could live quietly in the edges of society. Let's float over to the life of one documented sin eater, a man named Thomas Williamson, who lived somewhere near the borderlands of Shropshire in the early 1700s. He was small, wiry, and, according to a local parish record, much given to coughing at inopportune moments. Which is to say, he had the ideal physicality for carrying other people's sins around, plus the perfect background of social invisibility. People brought him into homes during funerals, passed him the symbolic bread, muttered their prayers, and he quietly did his work. No applause, no fanfare, just bread, murmurs, and digestion. Williamson apparently developed a certain reputation, not heroic, not notorious, just known. In one account, a particularly pious widow insisted he eat a larger than usual piece of bread because her husband had been a man of many debts, debts both financial and spiritual. Thomas did it, chewed, swallowed, nodded. Went home, night fell, no one thought about him until the next funeral. And in that simplicity, there's something strangely rhythmical about the practice, repetitive, soothing, slightly absurd, quietly human. The work could be dangerous, socially speaking. If a sin eater fell ill or died, rumors flew that perhaps the sins they consumed had finally caught up. Sometimes they were avoided, feared, or whispered about in churchyards. Their moral position was curious, necessary, yet morally and spiritually suspect. They weren't priests, they weren't saints, they were essentially spiritual janitors, and, like janitors, they were easy to forget until the mess got too obvious. But sin eating wasn't just about death. It was also about negotiation with the cosmos. People believed that sins could linger, that misfortune followed households like a shadow. And here comes the sin eater, nibbling on a rye biscuit, quietly taking that weight off the shoulders of everyone else. From a distance, it looks calm, almost meditative. Up close, it's human desperation meeting ritual, a combination of superstition, poverty, and social necessity. Interestingly, there were regional differences. In some Welsh villages, sin eating included a short chant or prayer. In English borderlands, it was mostly silent, punctuated by sighs from the family. In both cases, it was slow, meticulous, and slightly boring in a way that makes it perfect for a bedtime story. Imagine a small, foggy house, an elderly man chewing bread while a widow quietly counts her blessings, or regrets. The rhythm of chewing, the quiet murmur of prayers, the faint tick of a clock. Sleepy, slow, and inevitable. Let's pause briefly on the bread itself. It wasn't just sustenance, it was symbolic. Sometimes it was buttered, sometimes stale, sometimes dipped in ale. Each bite was a promise that sins would leave the living. And again, the irony, all the sin eater got in return was a meal, not forgiveness, not relief, just a full belly and a slightly heavier soul. And often they carried this invisible, spiritual burden for the rest of their lives. Imagine dinner conversation. So, what did you do today? Oh, just ate someone else's moral failings. You? A few literary references survived, but only a handful. The practice was, after all, socially uncomfortable. You didn't want to write about it in church records unless you had to. But it lingered in folklore. Tales describe shadowy figures walking the hills after funerals, hunched, muttering, bread in hand. Kids were told not to follow them, not because they were dangerous, but because the idea of consuming sins was vaguely terrifying and, let's be honest, mildly gross. Who wants to think about someone eating all your mistakes like a stale cookie? And yet, despite the strangeness, it had a kind of rhythm to it. Life, death, bread, chewing, murmuring, quiet, fading away. Sleepy, inevitable, and strangely reassuring. Because in the middle of all this, the families knew one thing. Someone was taking the burden off their shoulders. Someone was making death a little less complicated. Not heroic, not glamorous, not lasting, but practical, human. Eventually, the practice faded. Industrialization, urbanization, and changing religious beliefs made it obsolete. People stopped needing a human intermediary for sins. Clergy or confessionals, or just ignoring it, worked fine. And the sin eaters? They mostly disappeared from the historical record, quietly as they had always existed. Occasionally, a note in a parish ledger or a local folk tale preserves them, but largely they returned to obscurity, exactly where their work demanded them to be, in the shadows, unnoticed, quietly digesting humanity's moral leftovers. So, as you settle deeper into your blanket, maybe imagine a foggy village in the hills of Wales. Hear the distant church bells. See a small, hunched figure with bread in hand. Slow chewing, slow murmurs. Life continues, death continues, and someone, somewhere, is taking on the weight nobody else wants to carry. The world keeps turning, quietly, rhythmically, almost monotonously, like a very slow heartbeat. And with that, we leave Thomas Williamson for now and drift toward other curious souls who carried humanity's oddities on their shoulders or in their stomachs. There were women, too, as it turns out, quietly performing the same ritual, often in more isolated villages, sometimes with their own slight variations of ritual and prayer. The work was never different in kind, but in each individual there was a subtle rhythm, a slightly different style of quiet absorption. Some muttered while chewing, some hummed, some simply stared at the floor. And in all cases, it was enough to make the grief of the living just a little lighter. Sleepily, almost imperceptibly, the world of the sin eater shows a pattern, repetition, quietness, marginality, and an odd human persistence. People may forget the sin eater, but for a moment, in a darkened room with a coffin and bread in hand, their work made the universe feel a little more ordered, a little more digestible, literally. So, here we are again. Nestle in a little deeper, maybe adjust your pillow. We're moving further into the foggy, uneven hills of Britain, where people quietly carried other people's moral leftovers. And, as it turns out, there's more to this story than just Thomas Williamson. Of course there is, because why would history ever leave something simple alone? Take, for example, a woman named Martha Pritchard. She lived somewhere near Denbighshire in the late 18th century. Very little is known about her early life, which, given her profession, is fitting. Nobody cared about her childhood, probably because she spent most of it quietly absorbing the world's injustices and bad choices. When she became a sin eater, she apparently developed a signature method. She would hum a little Welsh lullaby while chewing the bread. Some families found it comforting, others found it slightly unsettling. Either way, it worked. Martha's story shows the subtle social complexities of sin eating. On one hand, families needed her. On the other, they whispered about her behind her back, calling her the one who eats other people's burdens. In small villages, gossip is practically oxygen, so you can imagine the conversations. Did you see Martha at the Jenkins funeral? She ate the sins again, like always. And the murmured addition, I wonder if she ever gets indigestion. Which, realistically, she probably did. Interestingly, some accounts describe sin eaters as being slightly obsessive, not in a dramatic way, but careful, meticulous. They had to chew thoroughly, sometimes turn the bread in their hands, dip it in ale, or even sprinkle it with a pinch of salt. It's hard to imagine anyone calling this glamorous work. It's not, but in its quiet repetitiveness, there's something oddly soothing, like watching a pendulum swing slowly back and forth, or a cat deliberately knocking over the same vase every evening. Now, sin eating wasn't always just one-person job. In some villages, there were rival sin eaters. Yes, rivalries over whose bread-chewing technique was more spiritually effective. Imagine that. Two elderly women,
hunched in the cold light of a churchyard, competing silently to see who could remove sins more efficiently. No applause, just quiet competitiveness, and maybe a cough or two to assert dominance. In some cases, families would call one sin eater over another, not because one was morally superior, but because she had a faster chewing rate. Efficiency in spiritual absorption matters, apparently. By this time, the practice had spread across several regions. Cornwall, Shropshire, and parts of Scotland had their own variants. Some included small prayers, others relied on ritual gestures like tapping the coffin or drawing a circle in the dirt. And some sin-eaters, for reasons lost to time, wore a small coin or charm while eating the bread, as though it helped them carry the sins more safely. This, of course, made their already marginal position slightly weirder and possibly more isolated. People nodded politely, muttered thanks, and then hurried away, leaving the sin-eater to their quiet, slightly absurd work. One particularly curious figure was a man known only as Old Reese. His claim to fame, if you can call it that, was surviving decades of chewing sins. Parish records note his presence at funerals stretching across the 1730s to the 1760s. He became something of a legend, not because he was heroic, but because he simply lasted. Other sin-eaters passed away, overwhelmed perhaps by the weight of all those human failings, but Reese just chewed, swallowed, and kept going. One can only assume he had a very strong digestive system or an extraordinary tolerance for existential fatigue. The families who hired him were usually quiet, rural, and deeply superstitious. They believed in sin-eating as both a literal and metaphorical act. There's something very human in that combination, part ritual, part desperation, part simple faith in repetition. The bread, the murmured prayers, the somber presence of the sin-eater, it all added up to a strangely tactile reassurance that in some corner of the universe, someone was taking care of the mess so the living could continue relatively unburdened. And yes, it could get awkward. Some families, uncomfortable with the idea of someone literally consuming moral residue, tried to disguise the act. They would hand the bread under a cloth or whisper prayers into the sin-eater's ear rather than watching directly. But the sin-eater, ever professional, adapted. They had seen every awkward variation possible. Chewing in silence, smiling faintly when someone murmured thanks, and moving on to the next house. The work was methodical, rhythmic, almost hypnotic, perfectly suited to a quiet, sleepy story like this one. In a few places, sin-eating became almost institutionalized. Certain villages had a roster of sin-eaters, each one assigned to particular households. This was less about fairness and more about logistics. A busy parish might have 3 or 4 funerals in a single week. One sin-eater can only chew so fast. Efficiency, after all, is underrated in the spiritual economy. The bread kept moving, the sins kept disappearing, and the world kept quietly spinning. Yet, despite all the organization, sin-eaters remained socially marginal. They weren't invited to weddings. They weren't considered proper neighbors. Sometimes children were warned to keep a respectful distance. They were needed, yes, but not trusted. It's the odd paradox, essential yet avoided, visible yet invisible, like the soft ticking of a clock in an empty room, always present, almost comforting, and yet not really acknowledged.
Some sin-eaters, according to folklore, even developed minor eccentricities over time: a chronic hummer of sad tunes, a compulsive bread dipper, a collector of tiny charms to ward off absorbed sins gone rogue. You can imagine an elderly widow walking through a foggy graveyard, bread in hand, muttering to herself, occasionally glancing nervously at the trees. Not frightening, not heroic, just persistently, quietly carrying the weight of others. Eventually, the practice declined. Urbanization, changing religious attitudes, and the rise of professional clergy all made human sin-eaters largely unnecessary. Confessionals, sermons, and moral instruction replaced bread-chewing rituals, and many sin-eaters simply disappeared. Some died quietly as they had lived, others moved on to different work, perhaps as laborers, washerwomen, or tavern helpers. A few stubbornly persisted in isolated pockets long after most of society had stopped caring. But their legacy lingers in folklore, in old parish records, and in the faint, almost invisible rhythm of history. They remind us that human societies often outsource the uncomfortable, the morally ambiguous, and the slightly ridiculous, and that sometimes people quietly, patiently, and endlessly absorb burdens we can't or won't touch ourselves. So, as your eyelids begin to feel heavier, imagine old Reese, Martha Pritchard, and Thomas Williamson moving from house to house, bread in hand, murmuring softly.
Disappearing into the fog. No applause, no recognition, just the slow, steady act of taking the world's weight into a stomach that doesn't complain. They were unseen custodians of human moral residue, quietly shaping the lives of the living with something as simple and as strange as bread. And in that quiet, repetitive, slightly absurd labor, there's a kind of calm rhythm. Chew, murmur, swallow, move on. A lullaby for the moral universe. A gentle, sleepy reminder that even in our darkest or messiest moments, someone or something keeps things just a little more in order. All right, settle in a bit more. Adjust your blanket, maybe stretch your legs, and let your mind float over to the edges of villages where the fog rolls in slowly and the smell of damp earth mixes with faintly burnt hearths. We're moving toward the final chapters of the Sin Eater story. People who, for decades or centuries, quietly carried the burden of everyone else's moral leftovers. By the 19th century, sin eating was waning, not because anyone suddenly decided it was unnecessary. No, humans don't give up comfort rituals that easily. It declined because society itself was changing, quietly and inexorably. Industrialization brought towns, railways, and factories. People moved from remote villages to cramped city streets. Clergy gained more influence, offering structured confessionals and moral guidance. And, naturally, modern medicines started to creep in, because nothing says funeral ritual like a doctor reminding you that swallowing someone else's symbolic sins probably isn't great for digestion. The final generations of sin eaters were often elderly and stubborn. They persisted in small, isolated communities, quietly chewing bread at funerals while the rest of the world looked on, increasingly puzzled. One account from mid-19th century Wales describes an old woman named Lowry Evans, who had become something of a local legend. She was said to have eaten sins with the same diligence she once used to peel potatoes, which, if you imagine it, is exactly the sort of sleepy, monotonous ritual we've been floating through all along. Lowry reportedly refused any modernization of the practice.
She would not use prayer books, she would not alter her bread, and she especially refused coins. "The bread is enough," she muttered once to a visitor who politely inquired about payment. And so she continued, slow, deliberate, quiet, absorbing sins with almost mechanical calm. Villagers tolerated her presence with a combination of respect and awkward distance. She was essential, yet untouchable. Interestingly, even as the practice faded, some families tried to adapt it. There are anecdotes of improvised sin eaters, people pretending to take on the role just to satisfy superstitious relatives. These substitutes often fumbled, spilling bread, forgetting prayers, or mumbling the wrong incantations. And in each case, the story gently reminds us that sin eating wasn't just about rituals, it was about intentionality, subtle performance, and a kind of human patience that modern society rarely requires. The decline was slow, almost imperceptible. By the late 1800s, only a handful of true practitioners remained. Parish records note one man in Shropshire still being summoned in 1872, though his teeth were failing and he reportedly had trouble chewing the bread. He did it anyway, because that's what sin eaters did. They endured quietly, without fuss, carrying burdens no one else wanted to carry. And then, gradually, they disappeared. Not with a dramatic farewell, not with headlines or ceremonies, but quietly. One day, no one called them, no one passed the bread, no one muttered prayers into someone else's ear. The job simply ceased to exist. Families found other ways to cope. Organized funerals, confessions, charitable acts, maybe a quiet prayer or two. The rhythm of chewing, swallowing, and absorbing sins faded into folklore and dusty parish records. Yet echoes linger. Folk tales describe hunched figures wandering graveyards, still clutching bread. Sometimes they hum soft tunes, perhaps remnants of centuries-old lullabies. Occasionally, scholars stumble across references to sin eaters in old journals, diaries, or court records. And sometimes, if you squint in a foggy Welsh village at dusk, you might imagine a figure moving silently among gravestones, performing a ritual that no longer has a living audience. It's also worth noting that the moral and social paradox of sin eating persisted till the very end. Even when people respected or relied on sin eaters, they continued to regard them as marginal, slightly untrustworthy, or morally ambiguous. This is, of course, entirely consistent with the human tendency to revere the people we need and ignore the ones we depend on. It's comforting, in a way, proof that history, like life, often quietly sidesteps the essential yet inconvenient. Some final anecdotes, because these are always a little sleepy and strangely satisfying. There's a story of a sin eater who reportedly traveled from village to village during a particularly harsh winter, carrying bread in a leather pouch. He was welcomed with a fire and a mug of ale at each stop, but the villagers remained politely distant, as if the sins he carried might somehow leap from him into the room. He lived long enough to witness the rise of the railways and the slow disappearance of his trade, but he kept walking, chewing, murmuring, unseen and essential until the very end. Another tale involves a woman who refused payment entirely, insisting that the act of consuming sins was itself her reward. Parish records note that she ate what no man would eat and bore what no man would bear, which is about as poetic and monotonous as any 19th century record gets. She apparently died quietly in her cottage, leaving behind a small pile of breadcrumbs, literal and metaphorical remnants of her labor. A few stories linger in literature and folklore. Some children's tales transformed the sin eater into a ghostly figure, a cautionary tale about humility, service, or occasionally the hazards of greed. And in some accounts, the figure is gentle, almost ethereal, a kind of reminder that certain burdens are best carried quietly, without recognition or reward. The end of sin eating is not dramatic. There are no final records of a last sin eater, no ceremonial closing. It simply faded, quietly, like smoke drifting from a candle that's burned low. The tradition survives in folklore, in stories whispered by scholars, and in the faint pattern of human ingenuity meeting superstition. And maybe, just maybe, that quiet persistence lingers in the imagination, a reminder that some of the world's most essential labor is invisible, uncelebrated, and slow. So, as you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the quiet rhythm one last time, bread in hand, soft murmur, chewing, swallowing, walking from house to house, from life to life, carrying the weight of the world in a stomach that never complains. Not heroic, not glamorous, just steady, essential, human. And with that, the world goes on, slightly lighter for the moment, because someone unseen, was there. As we reach the edges of this peculiar history, let's linger for a moment in the quiet aftermath. Sin eaters, once essential to the rhythm of rural life, have vanished from the living world, but their traces remain in subtle ways. The practice itself may be gone, but the idea of quietly taking on what others cannot bear, without applause, without recognition, resonates across time. By the 20th century, sin eating had become almost mythic. Scholars and folklorists pieced together fragments from parish records, diaries, and oral histories. They found the same patterns repeated: solitary figures, bread in hand, murmuring prayers, existing at the margins of society. A few even survived in memory into the 1920s, mostly in remote Welsh valleys, though no one can say for certain who they were. And in every case, the pattern is the same: essential, invisible, slightly feared, quietly enduring. What's striking when you look closely is the emotional labor involved. These weren't heroic acts, nor morally elevated. They were repetitive, mundane, sometimes unpleasant, and almost entirely invisible. And yet, they mattered. Someone's grief became a little lighter because of their quiet, methodical work. Someone's household felt a little safer from misfortune. The world continued, slightly more balanced, because bread had been chewed and murmured over in hushed, steady ritual. Interestingly, some anthropologists argue that sin eating reveals something fundamental about human societies: the need to externalize guilt, to assign physical acts to abstract moral weight. It's a pattern that shows up in other cultures under different forms. Shamans consuming symbolic objects, ritual sacrifices, or even modern therapeutic practices where the burden is spoken aloud to another person. In a way, sin eaters were proto-therapists, spiritual accountants, and digestive laborers rolled into one. They carried the intangible in the most tangible way possible, through bread and through patience. The people themselves were never celebrated. Their lives were often hard, marked by poverty or marginalization, but they persisted because necessity demanded it. And perhaps because there's a quiet dignity in doing something essential, day after day, with minimal recognition. It's a lesson in endurance, patience, and invisibility. One might even say that in their obscurity they embodied a form of quiet heroism, though never the sort that would make it into novels or history books with fanfare. There's also a strange irony in their work. They were simultaneously feared and needed, revered and shunned. Families required them, yet they were careful to maintain distance. Children were warned not to follow them, partly out of superstition and partly because the act of consuming sins seemed vaguely contaminating. Adults might invite them in, mutter their thanks, and then quickly return to normal life, leaving the sin eater to quietly finish their work.
This tension between necessity and marginality defines much of their story, always present, never fully accepted, quietly indispensable. Even the material culture around sin eating is curious. Bread, sometimes ale, occasionally a coin or charm, mundane objects that carried extraordinary significance. Chewing became a ritualized act of moral transfer. Swallowing became a statement of endurance and patience. And walking away, after a funeral, empty-handed but burdened in body, became a performance of human resilience. One can almost imagine it as a slow, sleepy ballet. Small gestures, minimal speech, immense symbolic weight. The legacy of sin eaters persists in literature, folklore, and collective imagination. Writers occasionally refer to them as ghosts of moral responsibility, shadows of societal conscience, or simply the quiet figures who remind us that human systems of care are often invisible. And in a world increasingly obsessed with recognition, record-keeping, and performance, the idea of someone quietly absorbing the world's moral leftovers without notice feels, in its own odd way, almost radical. As for the final act of their history, it is as quiet as their lives. Industrialization, modern religion, and societal change removed the need for literal sin eaters. The bread was no longer necessary. The murmurs were no longer required, and those who had persisted for decades either passed away, faded into anonymity, or quietly adapted to other forms of labor. No ceremony marked the end, no parades, no tributes, just silence. And yet the memory lingers, faintly, in the stories and records they left behind. Perhaps the most striking lesson is the simplicity of it all. Life, death, bread, chewing, murmuring, absorbing, moving on. The act was unremarkable on the surface, but it held a deep human resonance, the ability to bear what others cannot, to stabilize the world in small, unnoticed ways, and to persist quietly despite social marginalization. There's a rhythm to it, a repetition that feels almost meditative, small acts sustained over time, quietly shaping the lives of others. In the end, the story of sin eaters is not one of spectacle, heroism, or dramatic moral triumph. It is a story of slow, steady endurance, of quiet labor, and of human imagination finding a way to cope with guilt, grief, and the intangible burdens of life. It reminds us that history is not only made by kings, generals, and famous figures, but also by those who work invisibly at the margins, chewing bread, murmuring prayers, and carrying the weight of the world without expectation, applause, or notice. And that is where the story rests, in quiet persistence, in unnoticed labor, and in the rhythm of small human acts that, while forgotten by most, quietly shaped the lives of many. Let's float back about 2,000 years to ancient Rome, where people did things very differently indeed. Now, when we think about Rome, most people imagine grand colosseums, toga parties, and, of course, Julius Caesar. But beneath the marble and the marches, there were everyday realities that were, well, let's say, peculiar. One of those realities involved something the Romans called the tersorium. You're probably wondering, what in the world is a tersorium? Don't worry, it's not a new kind of sandwich. No, it was basically a sponge on a stick. That's right, a sponge attached to a little wooden or metal handle.
and Romans used it after using the bathroom. I know, it's not exactly bedtime reading, but stay with me, because the story behind this is actually kind of fascinating if you ignore the obvious ick factor. You see, the Romans didn't have toilet paper, obviously, and in public latrines, those long benches with holes in a row, kind of like a very uncomfortable communal spa, using a sponge on a stick was considered standard practice. Hygiene standards were, well, different. And yes, the sponges were communal. That's right, they were shared. You'd rinse it in a bucket of water or vinegar and pass it along to the next person. Not exactly what we'd call germ conscious today. But here's the thing. The Romans were oddly thoughtful about public sanitation. They had aqueducts, baths, plumbing, drainage systems, and then, apparently, a stick with a sponge. Because why not double down? The tersorium, besides being a bathroom tool, was also a kind of social equalizer. In these public latrines, senators, merchants, and the occasional unlucky tourist would sit side by side. No partitions, just holes in a bench and a shared sponge. And while we might recoil at the idea now, at the time it was just life. And life in Rome was full of these little ironies. Speaking of ironies, let's float over to another Roman oddity, the Emperor Claudius. Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 CE, was famously unconventional. He had a limp, a stammer, and maybe one too many accidents with falling debris, because apparently things fell on him more than anyone else in Rome. Yet he became emperor. And, as emperor, he had a curious relationship with hygiene and bureaucracy. Claudius reportedly passed a law to standardize bathroom practices. Yes, laws about toilets. He wanted every public latrine to have a sponge on a stick ready, because the empire needed consistency, and if there's one thing Romans loved, it was order, even if the order involved communal sponges. Now, we could linger on the Tersorium and Claudius for a while. Imagine walking through a Roman market and hearing, "Sponges are freshly rinsed." But there's another reason this little sponge is historically interesting. It tells us something about human habits, about the weird ways civilizations try to balance hygiene, efficiency, and social norms. In Rome, a sponge on a stick was as mundane as a fork or a candle. People didn't think twice, and it's a small window into the everyday lives of ordinary Romans. Of course, not all Romans were the same. Some had personal sponges, often soaked in vinegar or salt water to minimize, well, exposure. Some even carried their own sponges when traveling. Think of it as the Roman equivalent of hand sanitizer, if hand sanitizer were a wet, scratchy sponge. And the wealthier citizens? They might have had attendants whose entire job was to keep sponges clean, cut to size, and ready for use. A noble career path, I suppose, if you didn't mind a bit of contact. Let's drift now to another emperor with a taste for slightly odd practices, Nero. Nero, the one famous for fiddling while Rome burned, or maybe not, historians argue endlessly about that one. Nero was an emperor who liked things theatrical, including his bathrooms. He had a private latrine on a rotating platform in his palace. The idea was that you could sit, spin around, and still enjoy your view of the gardens. Practical? Not really. Showy? Absolutely. And yes, he likely had personal sponges that were cleaner than anything the public latrines could offer. Meanwhile, the rest of Rome kept up with communal sponges, stepping carefully to avoid what one contemporary described as the unintended surprises of shared hygiene. And in case you're wondering, Romans also used other cleaning methods, cloths, shells, bits of moss, depending on where you were and how rich you were, but the tersorium remained iconic. The story of the sponge on a stick is, in a way, the story of Rome itself. grand ambitions, ingenious engineering, a flair for drama, and a casual relationship with personal space and germs. It's a gentle reminder that no matter how advanced a civilization seems, roads, baths, aqueducts, they still had quirks, and sometimes those quirks involved sitting on a bench and sharing a damp piece of sea sponge. And while we're drifting through the lighter side of Roman hygiene, we should touch briefly on how Romans bathed, because it's connected. Public baths were a massive part of daily life. And yes, you would scrub yourself with sponges there too. They had an almost ritualistic approach to cleaning. Soak, scrape, rinse, repeat. And while the baths were places to relax and gossip, they were also places where the sponge hierarchy played out. Wealthier patrons had fancier sponges. Poorer folks, well, you know. So tonight, as you get cozy under your blankets, think of the Romans. Maybe picture a marble latrine, sunlight glinting off aqueducts, senators chatting over shared sponges. And remember, history isn't always about battles and kings. Sometimes it's about the small, strange details, the little things people did and somehow survived, like sitting on a communal sponge and pretending it was completely normal. Because in Rome, it was. Let's pause here for a moment, just letting that image settle. And in the next part, we'll wander through some other hygiene oddities in Rome, meet a few more emperors, and maybe even explore why the Romans' obsession with baths influenced their empire in ways that might surprise you, all without ever leaving the comfort of our gentle, sleepy narrative. All right, welcome back. Hopefully you're settled in, maybe halfway between a yawn and a slow blink. Let's continue floating through ancient Rome, where hygiene was complicated, imaginative, and occasionally a little gross. But in that complexity, there's a kind of calm, a rhythm almost, like a long, slow river running through history. We left off with the tersorium, the communal sponge on a stick. And while that's certainly memorable, it's only the tip of the Roman hygiene iceberg. Because Rome was obsessed with baths. Not just casually obsessed, we're talking monumental, daily, empire-wide obsession. Public baths, or thermae, were everywhere. Some were enormous complexes, complete with hot rooms, cold rooms, saunas, pools, gardens, libraries, and even snack bars. Yes, they had snack bars. Rome really thought of everything. Bathing was a social experience. You didn't just clean yourself, you mingled, you exercised, you gossiped, you argued about politics or poetry, and naturally, you brought your sponge. Sometimes you used it for bathing, sometimes for other purposes. The line was flexible, because in Rome, the line between public and private was thinner than the water in the cold plunge. Speaking of emperors and their peculiar habits, let's drift to Caligula. Caligula ruled from 37 to 41 CE and was famous or infamous, depending on your sources, for his eccentricities. He once supposedly made his horse a priest. He also had unusual bathing habits. Some stories suggest he enjoyed watching people bathe from balconies or even joining in on unexpected occasions. And yes, it's likely he had a personal army of sponges, because why trust anyone else with the task? Meanwhile, the average Roman citizen maintained a modest routine. A visit to the baths might involve a warm soak, a scrub with oil and a curved metal scraper called a strigil, and a dip in cold water. Then, after the bathing ritual, out came the sponge on a stick. And here's a gentle, slightly snarky aside. Romans were meticulous with cleanliness, for a society that also ate raw dormice and left garbage in the streets. But somehow it worked, for centuries. And while we're drifting lazily through these bathhouse rituals, it's worth mentioning that hygiene extended beyond bathing. Wealthy Romans had private latrines in their homes, but these were often simple benches over a drainage channel. In some estates, they even had fainting couches nearby, because apparently relieving oneself could be tiring or even dramatic. And the sponge, still present. Never underestimate the Romans' dedication to the sponge. Let's float to another figure, Emperor Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 CE. Domitian had a reputation for paranoia, controlling behavior, and a taste for theatrical displays. Reports suggest he had attendants whose sole duty was to maintain his personal hygiene, which included preparing his sponges. Domitian liked order. Everything had its place, and everything, including cleanliness, was ceremonial. Public latrines? Not his concern. He had private, luxurious arrangements, and he probably judged anyone who failed to rinse properly. But back in the public sphere, life continued with communal sponges, and this strangely fostered a kind of intimacy, or discomfort, depending on your perspective. People knew each other by sight, sound, and sometimes scent. The latrines were arenas of subtle social observation. Senators would nod to merchants, slaves would whisper gossip, and all the while the sponge circled. There's also the matter of smell. Romans tried to mask odors with perfumes, incense, and oils, but inevitably a public latrine had a certain aroma. And yet people carried on, because life went on. Baths were warm, water flowed, sponges were ready. The daily rhythm continued. Now let's drift gently toward the slightly stranger aspects of Roman hygiene culture. In some public baths, there were attendants called capsari. Their job was to hold the bather's belongings and sometimes their sponges. This could be a delicate position because the sponge was not just a cleaning tool, it was a symbol. It was hygiene, it was status, it was, well, personal territory. Mishandle the sponge, and you might face an awkward confrontation. And speaking of status, let's consider Emperor Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138 CE. Hadrian was known for architecture, building walls, and traveling the empire extensively. But he also took bathing seriously. He reportedly had pools heated to exact temperatures, gardens designed for contemplation after a soak, and yes, sponges. Hadrian's sponges were likely the best in the empire, soft, clean, and ready for precise use. Meanwhile, the common citizen might have had a sponge that was less precise, perhaps a bit frayed, perhaps smelling faintly of vinegar or whatever solution had been used to rinse it. And yet they carried on, immersed in the social rhythm of the bathhouse, the shared latrine, the communal sponge. Because for Romans, hygiene was not just about cleanliness, it was about connection, routine, and, in a way, resilience. And let's float briefly into another curious element, the folones. Folones were professional launderers, responsible for cleaning clothes, but sometimes involved in public hygiene rituals. They worked with urine for cleaning, yes, urine, and might have been the ones to supply vinegar or rinse water for sponges. So, if you were at the baths and saw a folones bustling about, they weren't just washing your toga, they were also contributing to the subtle hygiene web of the empire. Now, if all this talk of sponges, baths, and emperors feels a bit tedious, that's kind of the point. Life in Rome had a rhythm, a flow, a sequence of small, mundane actions that, taken together, formed civilization. And while we may focus on conquest, politics, or architecture, it's the ordinary, slightly uncomfortable routines that reveal the most about how Romans lived. By now, perhaps you're feeling a gentle drowsiness, as if the hum of aqueducts and the lapping of bath water have traveled through time and into your bedroom. And that's exactly the effect of history told in this way, slow, calm, and subtly absurd. Imagine sitting in a marble bath, sharing a sponge, watching the sunlight dance on the mosaic floors, and thinking, yes, this is life. Messy, communal, occasionally pungent, but life nonetheless. So, before we move on to the next chapter of Roman hygiene oddities, let's pause. Take a slow breath, picture the bathhouses, the latrines, the sponges gently passing from hand to hand, and know that in a small way you're connected to those Romans across centuries through the strange and enduring ritual of cleanliness. In the next part, we'll drift even further into the bizarre and mundane world of Roman personal habits. We'll meet more emperors, some curious citizens, and explore the subtle ironies of hygiene, health, and status in the empire, always at a calm, sleepy pace. You're probably feeling a little sleepy, a little curious, and maybe a little grateful for modern plumbing. That's good. We're in no rush. Let's take our time and wander gently into the late Roman Empire, where hygiene continued to be, well, a mix of ingenuity, oddity, and occasional olfactory offense. By the 3rd and 4th century CE, Rome was changing. The empire was larger, administration more complex, and the population more diverse. And yet, certain traditions persisted. The tersorium, our humble sponge on a stick, remained a constant companion of public latrines. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the communal sponge didn't disappear overnight. Some historians speculate it stuck around simply because habits die hard, or maybe because no one wanted to invent toilet paper. Either way, the sponge endured. Public latrines were still central to Roman social life. You could sit on stone benches for hours, talking politics, sharing gossip, or just contemplating life. And the sponge was your partner in all this. Some latrines were beautifully decorated, with mosaics, running water, and nearby fountains. Imagine, if you will, a marble floor, sunlight streaming through windows, and somewhere nearby a sponge gently soaking in a bucket of water. Serenity in a slightly damp form. Emperors continued to influence hygiene culture, sometimes in strange ways. Take Constantine the Great, who ruled from 306 to 337 CE. Constantine was more famous for converting the empire to Christianity, but he also oversaw urban development, including baths and sanitation projects. He recognized that clean water was essential, not just for health, but for imperial image. Sponges were likely present, of course. Somewhere in the empire, attendants scrubbed, rinsed, and replaced them. It's hard to imagine the emperor himself worrying about it. But the system, in its subtle efficiency, depended on small, repetitive actions like these. And speaking of small, repetitive actions, we should note that Romans didn't just rely on sponges for hygiene. They had elaborate routines involving oils, scrapers, and various scented compounds. After a bath, a citizen might anoint themselves with oil, scrape it off with a strigil, rinse again, and then apply more oil. The sponge might be used at several stages, gently, rhythmically, almost meditatively. In a world without modern distractions, these rituals created a slow, almost hypnotic rhythm, perfect for drifting off to sleep if you weren't sitting in a public latrine at the time. The late empire also saw some unusual innovations. In some cities, there were early forms of flush systems, water channels that carried waste away. But these were inconsistent. Often the sponge remained the primary tool, a simple, low-tech solution in a complex society. And it worked. People lived long enough, built monuments, and somehow managed to govern an empire. Hygiene wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Now let's drift into the realm of superstition and personal habits, because Romans often linked hygiene with fortune. Baths and latrines were sometimes associated with purification rituals. People believed that cleanliness could influence health, luck, and even morality. So the sponge wasn't just a sponge, it was a tool of order, ritual, and subtle power. Imagine a citizen carefully rinsing a sponge, knowing that this small act was part of a larger cosmic balance, comforting in a strange, damp way. And, naturally, the wealthy continued to indulge in personal hygiene extravagances. Villas had private latrines, heated pools, and attendants devoted entirely to cleanliness. Some sponges were cut to precise sizes, others were infused with scents, some were replaced daily. The wealthy could maintain a level of comfort that the average citizen could only dream of, though both groups relied on the sponge. And that's the curious part. A simple, slightly unglamorous object connected all levels of Roman society. Meanwhile, the common folk adapted creatively. If a sponge was unavailable, moss, wool, or bits of cloth might suffice. Public latrines remained social hubs. People whispered, joked, and gossiped while maintaining routines that were as familiar to them as morning coffee is to us. And the sponge, quietly soaking in its bucket, waited for the next user, patient and unassuming. We can also drift into a minor but telling irony. Emperors often built luxurious baths and lavish facilities, yet never eliminated the communal sponge, because why reinvent a perfectly functional, if slightly uncomfortable tool? It was reliable, inexpensive, and somehow emblematic of Roman pragmatism. Sponges were humble, unglamorous, yet indispensable, a quiet, persistent presence in an empire known for grandeur and spectacle. Now, as we slowly glide toward the end of our exploration, it's worth reflecting on the sponge's symbolic role. Rome was about ambition, conquest, architecture, and philosophy, and yet, at the core, everyday life relied on small, repetitive acts: washing, scrubbing, rinsing, and sharing. And through it all, the sponge endured, humble, unassuming, quietly functional. It reminds us that history is not just the stories of emperors and battles, it's also the rhythm of daily life, the persistence of simple tools, and the human need for ritual, hygiene, and comfort. By now, you might feel a subtle warmth of sleepiness, a gentle drowsiness, as if the marble floors and the murmur of fountains have traveled across centuries into your room. And that's the point. We're not here to thrill, we're here to drift, to observe, to float through the mundane and the strange, the practical and the absurd, in a calm, measured way. So, as the sponge rests in its bucket, the water flows gently through the latrine channels, and Rome continues its slow, deliberate rhythm. Let yourself drift along. History doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And in tonight's story, it whispers about hygiene, sponges, emperors, and the quiet persistence of human routines. In the next part, we'll wrap up with a few final reflections on the broader lessons of Roman hygiene, the cultural quirks that persisted beyond the empire, and perhaps even a nod to how our modern habits echo these ancient, damp rituals, all in the same gentle, sleep-inducing style. Our little journey through Rome. By now you might be imagining marble floors, gentle water channels, faint sunlight spilling into baths, and yes, the ever-present sponge, quietly waiting in its bucket. And that's perfect, because tonight we're not racing to a conclusion, we're easing, drifting, and letting history settle like dust in a calm room. Let's begin with a simple reflection. The story of the tessorium, the sponge on a stick, is in many ways a story about continuity, about persistence, about the small, mundane habits that define life even in the midst of empire.
Conquest and spectacle. While emperors built walls, minted coins, and waged wars, ordinary Romans scrubbed, rinsed, and shared sponges. And somehow, both things were equally important to the rhythm of daily life. Even as the empire faced challenges, the pressures of politics, invasions, economic shifts, hygiene routines endured. Baths were still visited, latrines remained social spaces, the sponge circulated gently from hand to hand. And perhaps there's a lesson there for us. Amid chaos, small rituals give structure. They offer rhythm. They create a kind of comfort, even in a world that's often messy. Emperors like Claudius, Nero, Domitian, and Hadrian may seem distant or eccentric, but in the end, they participated in this flow. Whether by issuing regulations, enjoying private pools, or delegating sponge duty to attentive attendants, they were part of the same human project as every citizen in the empire. And that's oddly reassuring. History isn't only about grand achievements, it's about shared experience, repeated gestures, and the quiet persistence of ordinary life. We might also think of the sponge as a symbol, humble, utilitarian, and unglamorous, yet vital. It quietly connected generations of Romans, rich and poor, powerful and anonymous. It reminds us that small things matter, small things endure, and small things can tell stories that last millennia, whispering across time about how people lived, what they valued, and how they coped with the everyday realities of existence. And as we drift toward the very end, it's comforting to remember that Rome, in all its grandeur and absurdity, was built on repetition. Baths, sponges, scraping routines, shared latrines, and public conversations. The empire may have crumbled centuries ago, but the rhythms of daily life, careful, mundane, strangely intimate, persisted in human memory, in writings, and even in our imagination. So as you settle under your blankets tonight, picture the gentle flow of a Roman bathhouse, the sun glinting off mosaics, the soft splash of water in fountains, the rhythmic scrubbing and rinsing of a sponge that has seen centuries pass. Imagine for a moment that you are part of that long, slow history, connected to countless others by the simplest of objects. And now let your eyelids grow heavy. Let the image of marble, water, and sponges drift away softly, like the last murmur of a fountain. You've wandered through time, explored the rhythms of empire, and glimpsed the oddly human details that make history not just fascinating, but strangely comforting. Good night, dear listener. Let the gentle whispers of ancient Rome carry you into sleep. Dream of calm marble floors, of warm baths, of sponges quietly resting in their buckets, and know that in some small way you are connected to a world that lived, laughed, and washed in remarkably familiar ways. Sleep well.